What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors comes face to face with television's most controversial panel? You won't believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington sits down for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to find himself trapped in a verbal minefield that would leave viewers across America stunned and social media exploding with outrage. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when this legendary actor reaches his breaking point on live television. The atmosphere in the View studio was already charged with an unusual tension as Denzel Washington made his entrance. That familiar confident stride carrying him across the stage to the guest chair. The audience erupted in their typical enthusiastic applause, but something felt different about this morning's energy. Perhaps it was the way the hosts exchanged glances as he settled into his seat. Or maybe it was the almost predatory gleam in their eyes as they prepared to dive into what they clearly believed would be easy prey. Denzel, welcome back to The View, the lead host began, her voice carrying that deceptively sweet tone that regular viewers had learned to recognize as a warning sign. We're so excited to have you here to talk about your latest project. But first, we have to address something that's been making headlines. Washington's expression remained pleasantly neutral, though those who knew him well might have caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Of course, what would you like to discuss? Well, there's been a lot of conversation lately about masculinity in Hollywood, and frankly, about men in general. Another host jumped in, her voice gaining momentum like a train building steam. And we've been wondering about your thoughts on toxic masculinity, particularly given some of the roles you've chosen throughout your career. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the loaded nature of the question. Washington leaned back slightly, his hands folded calmly in his lap, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was already calculating his next move. I think masculinity, like any human trait, exists on a spectrum, he replied. Carefully. I've always tried to portray complex, nuanced characters who represent different aspects of the human experience. But don't you think, the third host interjected, her voice rising with what seemed like practiced indignation, that many of your roles perpetuate outdated stereotypes about what it means to be a man? The strong, silent type? The protector? The patriarch? These are concepts that many people, especially younger generations, are moving away from. Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I think there's value in portraying strength, both physical and emotional. There's nothing wrong with being protective of the people you love or taking responsibility for your actions and your family. But that's exactly the problem, the lead host pressed, leaning forward with the intensity of a prosecutor closing in on a confession. This idea that men need to be protectors, that they need to be strong and stoic, it's damaging not just to men, but to society as a whole. It prevents emotional growth, it perpetuates power imbalances, and frankly, it's become irrelevant in today's world. The audience had gone eerily quiet now, the usual murmurs and occasional applause completely absent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense they were witnessing something unprecedented, their lenses capturing every micro-expression on Washington's increasingly strained face. I disagree with that assessment, Washington said, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before. I think there's a difference between toxic behavior and positive masculine traits. Teaching young men to be responsible, to stand up for what's right, to protect those who can't protect themselves. These aren't outdated concepts. But who decides what's right? The second host challenged, her voice taking on an almost mocking tone. Who decides who needs protection? Isn't that just another form of patriarchal control, disguised as nobility? Washington's hands had unconsciously clenched into fists, though he kept them resting calmly on his knees. I think we're confusing strength with dominance, and protection with control. When I teach my children about responsibility and integrity, I'm not trying to control anyone. I'm trying to prepare them to be good human beings. Your children. The third host seized on the phrase like a weapon. Let's talk about that. You've raised your children with what many would consider very traditional values. Don't you worry that you're setting them up for failure in a world that's rapidly evolving beyond those old-fashioned ideals? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since the interview began, Washington's carefully maintained composure showed visible cracks. His eyes flashed with something dangerous, something that made even the most combative of the hosts unconsciously lean back in their chairs. My children are successful, well-adjusted individuals who contribute positively to society, he said, each word carefully measured but loaded with barely contained emotion. I'm proud of the values I've instilled in them, and I won't apologize for raising them to be strong, compassionate, and responsible. But don't you see how that very response proves our point? The lead host pounced, her voice rising with what seemed like triumph. This defensive reaction, this inability to even consider that your approach might be flawed, it's exactly what we're talking about when we discuss toxic masculinity. The studio had become a pressure cooker, the tension so thick it seemed to affect even the lighting. Washington sat perfectly still for a moment that stretched like an eternity, his breathing slow and deliberate, his eyes moving from host to host with the calculated precision of a man who had just realized he was surrounded by adversaries rather than interviewer. But what happened next would push this confrontation beyond the point of no return, transforming what had started as a challenging interview into something far more explosive. You know what I find fascinating, Denzel? The lead host continued, her voice dripping with condescension as she leaned forward like a predator sensing weakness. You sit there defending these antiquated ideas about masculinity, but when we challenge you on them, you get defensive. Isn't that exactly the kind of fragile ego we're talking about when we discuss problematic male behavior? The words hit Washington like a physical blow. His entire body tensed, and for a moment, the mask of professional courtesy slipped completely. Fragile ego, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Because I defend my right to raise my children with values I believe in. Well, let's be honest. The second host jumped in, sensing blood in the water. Your generation of men was raised to believe that questioning your authority or your methods was somehow disrespectful. But we live in a different world now. A world where women and marginalized communities are finally finding their voices. And frankly, a lot of what you represent feels outdated and, dare I say, irrelevant. The word irrelevant struck Washington like a lightning bolt. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords, and his knuckles had gone white where his hands gripped the arms of his chair. The audience could feel the shift in energy, the way the very air in the studio seemed to crackle with barely contained fury. Irrelevant, he repeated slowly, as if testing the word on his tongue. 30-plus years in this industry, multiple Academy Awards, countless lives touched through my work and philanthropy. And you're calling me irrelevant because I believe in taking responsibility for my actions. We're not attacking your career, Denzel, the third host said with fake sympathy that fooled no one. We're simply saying that the version of masculinity you represent, the strong, silent, patriarchal figure, it's not what young people are looking for anymore. They want vulnerability, they want emotional availability, they want men who can admit when they're wrong. And you think I can't admit when I'm wrong? Washington's voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow seemed more menacing than if he had shouted. You think 30 years of marriage, raising 4 children, building a career based on integrity and hard work somehow makes me emotionally unavailable. But that's just it, the lead host pressed, clearly emboldened by what she perceived as his growing agitation. This anger you're displaying right now, this inability to have a calm conversation about these issues without getting emotional, it's exactly what we mean when we talk about toxic masculinity. The studio audience was now completely silent, many of them looking uncomfortable as they witnessed what was clearly becoming a character assassination disguised as an interview. Camera operators zoomed in on Washington's face, capturing every flicker of emotion as he processed the coordinated attack being launched against everything he stood for. Let me get this straight, Washington said, his voice gaining strength as his anger transformed into something colder and more focused. You invite me on your show, ostensibly to discuss my latest project. Instead, you ambush me with questions, designed to paint me as some kind of relic from a bygone era. You question my parenting, dismiss my values, call me irrelevant, and then when I defend myself and my family, you use that as proof that your initial accusations were correct. We're simply having a conversation, the second host replied, though her voice wavered slightly under the intensity of his stare. A conversation that clearly needed to happen, given your reaction. This isn't a conversation, Washington shot back, his composure finally cracking as decades of professionalism gave way to genuine outrage. This is a hit job. You've decided what narrative you want to push, and you're trying to force me into playing the villain in your little morality play. The lead host's eyes lit up with what looked like genuine excitement, as if Washington's growing anger was exactly what she had been hoping for. But don't you see? This is exactly what we're talking about. When confronted with ideas that challenge your worldview, you become aggressive, you shut down dialogue. I shut down dialogue. Washington interrupted, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. You've spent the last 10 minutes telling me that everything I believe, everything I've taught my children, everything I've built my life on is wrong, outdated, and irrelevant. And when I try to defend my position, you twist my words and use them against me. We're simply pointing out that the world has evolved, the third host said, her voice taking on a lecturing tone that made Washington's eyes flash with barely contained fury. And maybe, just maybe, it's time for you to evolve with it. Maybe it's time to admit that the strong, silent type isn't what we need anymore. What we need, Washington said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his accumulated anger and frustration, is fewer people who think they can tear down others to make themselves feel important. What we need is fewer people who mistake cynicism for intelligence and destruction for progress. The atmosphere in the studio had become electric with tension, every person present sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The hosts exchanged glances, clearly realizing they had pushed their guest far beyond the breaking point, but seemingly unable to resist continuing their assault. That's a very defensive response, Denzel, the lead host said, her voice now openly mocking. Very telling, actually. When faced with legitimate criticism of outdated gender roles, you resort to personal attacks instead of engaging with the actual issues. Washington stared at her for a long moment, his breathing slow and controlled, his entire body radiating a tension that made everyone in the studio unconsciously hold their breath. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second, until finally he spoke in a voice so quiet and controlled that it was somehow more terrifying than any shout could have been. Personal attacks, he repeated slowly. Like calling someone irrelevant? Like dismissing 30 years of work and contribution? Like questioning someone's fitness as a parent? His voice began to rise again, building like thunder before a storm. You want to talk about what's wrong with society today? It's people like you who think tearing others down somehow builds you up. But even as Washington reached this boiling point, the hosts weren't finished. What came next would be the final straw that would push this confrontation into territory from which there could be no return. You know what, Denzel? The lead host said, her voice taking on a tone of mock concern that was more insulting than outright hostility. Maybe this reaction is exactly why your type of masculinity is becoming obsolete. Look at yourself right now. You're red-faced, you're angry, you're defensive. Is this really the kind of role model you want to be for young men? Is this the emotional regulation you're so proud of? The words hung in the air like a poison cloud, and something fundamental shifted in Washington's demeanor. The professional mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. He sat perfectly still for a moment, his breathing the only sound audible in the suddenly silent studio. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone present understand they had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. Role model, he said slowly, each word precise and cutting. You want to talk about role models? Let's talk about what you're modeling right here, right now. You're modeling how to ambush a guest, how to twist someone's words, how to gang up on someone who came here in good faith to promote his work. We're asking legitimate questions about, the second host began, but Washington cut her off with a look so intense that she actually recoiled. No, he said, his voice rising with each word. You're not asking questions. You're making statements disguised as questions. You've already decided I'm guilty, and now you're just trying to get me to confess to crimes I didn't commit. The third host, clearly sensing that they were losing control of the narrative, made one final, devastating miscalculation. Denzel, I think you need to take a step back and really examine why this conversation is triggering you so much. Maybe there's some truth in what we're saying that you're not ready to face. Maybe your resistance to these ideas says more about you than our questions do. The suggestion that his anger was somehow proof of his guilt, that his defense of his values was evidence of their corruption, pushed Washington beyond the breaking point. He stood up slowly, his full height and presence suddenly dominating the studio in a way that made everyone present acutely aware of just how badly they had misjudged their target. "Triggering me," he repeated, his voice now carrying the full force of his accumulated fury. "You think I'm triggered? You think this is some kind of emotional breakdown?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it, only contempt. "Lady, I've been in this business for over 30 years. I've faced real criticism from real professionals, not this amateur hour character assassination you call journalism." The lead host, clearly realizing she had pushed too far, but unable to back down without losing face, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Denzel, we understand you're upset, but this kind of aggressive behavior is exactly what we're talking about when we discuss problematic masculinity. Can't you see that?" Washington stared at her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried such authority that every person in the studio hung on his words. "You want to know what's problematic? What's problematic is 3 grown women who think they can sit here and tear down a man's character, question his integrity, dismiss his life's work, and then act surprised when he stands up for himself." He began moving toward the edge of the stage, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the fury radiating from every line of his body. "You want to know what's toxic? What's toxic is this assumption that any man who disagrees with you must be fragile, outdated, or irrelevant. What's toxic is the idea that strength is somehow inherently wrong, that protecting your family is oppressive, that standing up for your values makes you a dinosaur." The host sat in stunned silence as Washington continued, his voice gaining power and clarity as he finally gave voice to thoughts that had clearly been building for some time. "You talk about evolution, about progress, about moving forward. But what you're really talking about is tearing down anything that doesn't fit your narrow worldview. You're not building anything positive. You're just destroying." "Denzel, please," the second host said weakly. "We didn't mean to." "Yes, you did." Washington cut her off sharply. "You meant every word. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was a calculated attack, and you know it. You thought you could bring me on here, ambush me with your agenda, and then use my reactions to prove whatever point you wanted to make." He had reached the edge of the stage now, but he turned back to face the hosts one final time, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the studio. "But here's what you didn't count on. Here's what people like you never understand. Real strength isn't about never getting angry. Real strength is about knowing when something is worth fighting for and having the courage to fight for it." The lead host made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Denzel, we hope you'll reconsider and reconsider." Washington's voice exploded across the studio with such force that several audience members actually jumped. "Reconsider what? Reconsider my values? Reconsider my integrity? Reconsider the way I've raised my children and built my career?" He shook his head slowly, his expression mixing disgust with profound disappointment. "The only thing I'm reconsidering is why I thought this show deserved my respect or my time. You want to know what's irrelevant? What's irrelevant is a bunch of people who think they can tear others down and call it progress." The silence that followed was deafening. Washington stood at the edge of the stage for a moment longer, his eyes moving from host to host, making sure each one understood the magnitude of what had just transpired. Then, without another word, he removed his microphone, placed it carefully on the guest chair, and walked off the stage with his head held high and his dignity intact. The host sat in stunned silence, clearly realizing too late that they had not only failed to diminish their guest, but had instead revealed something ugly about themselves in the process. The audience remained frozen, many of them looking uncomfortable and ashamed to have witnessed such a blatant attempt at character assassination. As Washington disappeared from view, the lead host finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Well, I think that tells us everything we need to know about toxic masculinity." But even she seemed to realize how hollow the words sounded in the aftermath of what had just occurred. The studio remained silent for several more seconds before the director finally called for a commercial break, leaving millions of viewers across America to process what they had just witnessed, not the breakdown of an outdated masculine ideal, but the revelation of what real strength and dignity look like when faced with coordinated cruelty disguised as progressive dialogue.